Malcolm Gladwell's essay, Small Change: Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted, discusses the role of social media in modern-day activism. Gladwell's essay uses many of the rhetorical techniques we have studied in this class, including anecdote, the definition example pattern, and compare and contrast. To review, an anecdote is a short account of a particular incident or event, or a short historical or biographical account. Anecdotes are used to support the argument that a writer is trying to make. The first 6 paragraphs of Gladwell's essay are one long anecdote that detail the origin and escalation of the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-in protests against segregation, which began in Greensboro, North Carolina. The introductory anecdote hooks the reader's attention by building tension. Let's take a look at an example that appears in paragraph 3. By the next morning, the protests had grown to 27 men and 4 women, most from the same dormitory as the original 4. The men were dressed in suits and ties. The students brought their schoolwork and studied as they sat at the counter. On Wednesday, students from Greensboro's Negro Secondary School, Dudley High, joined, and the number of protesters swelled to 80. By Thursday, the protesters numbered 300, including 3 women from the Greensboro campus of the University of North Carolina. By Saturday, the sit-in had reached 600. People spilled out into the streets. White teenagers waved Confederate flags. Someone threw a firecracker. At noon, the A&T football team arrived. "Here comes the wrecking crew," one of the white students shouted. The paragraph builds tension by escalating the size of the protests. We begin with just a handful of people, which swells to 80, then 300, then 600. There are also instances of danger that mark the paragraph: the Confederate flags, the firecracker, and the football team. All of this tension builds the reader's interest until we reach the thesis. The reader's attention is held for 6 paragraphs until we arrive at the thesis statement. These events in the early 60s became a civil war that engulfed the South for the rest of a decade, and it happened all without email, texting, Facebook, or Twitter. Finally, we get the introduction to what the essay is going to be about. But Gladwell's essay uses other rhetorical techniques as well. He uses the definition example pattern to introduce and explain 2 terms that are central to his argument: weak tie activism and strong tie activism. Gladwell tells us that activism depends on deep relationships, and in paragraph 12, we begin to get a definition of the term strong tie activism. Gladwell tells us that those students who participated in the civil rights movement and sat in at Woolworth's were more likely to have friends who were also part of the movement. Following that definition, we get 3 examples in the paragraph that help to illustrate or explain what strong tie activism is. The first example is the Red Brigades, an Italian terrorist group. The second is the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And finally, the third are the activists who gathered to organize for the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany. As part of his definition example pattern, Gladwell returns to his initial anecdote and tells us that the organizers of the Greensboro lunch counter sit-in were the best of friends, and thus demonstrated a kind of strong tie activism. The essay then contrasts this kind of activism with weak tie activism, that which Gladwell believes social media is part of. In paragraph 15, Gladwell introduces the term of weak tie activism and explains that social media activism is a kind of weak tie organizing because it doesn't require deep relationships. Paragraphs 17 and 18 introduce an example to illustrate the term weak tie. Samir Bhatia, a young Silicon Valley entrepreneur, sets up a Facebook campaign in order to get people to sign up for a donor registry. In paragraph 19, Gladwell continues with the definition example pattern, providing the example of the Save Darfur Facebook page as an example of weak tie activism. He claims it's easy to get over 1 million members to sign up for something when you're not asking them to do very much. This example helps to illustrate the term further. Through the contrast between the term strong tie and weak tie and the extended definition example patterns, Gladwell is emphasizing that the friendships we have in real life are more important to the kind of activism that actually challenges power. Gladwell concludes the essay by returning to anecdote, albeit a very different story from the one he opens with. This is another kind of contrast used in the essay. In paragraph 30, Gladwell begins the anecdote about Evan, a Wall Street executive whose girlfriend loses her cell phone in the back seat of a New York City taxicab. Evan launches a social media campaign using viral video in order to retrieve the cell phone. Gladwell is setting up a contrast between this closing anecdote about the cell phone and the opening anecdote about the lunch counter sit-ins. He wants us to consider the differences between them. In the closing anecdote, the person who finds and is accused of stealing the cell phone is a young teenager from Queens, while Evan is a Wall Street executive. Gladwell contrasts the age, gender, and class differences between Evan and the teenager. The teenager lives in Queens, whereas Evan works on Wall Street, thus indicating class difference. She is female, he is male. She is younger, he is older. By all social markers, Evan has the power. Weak tie activism serves Evan's purpose, in part because he already has power and privilege, and in part because he's not asking his audience to do very much. Gladwell wants us to contrast this with the opening anecdote about the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins. In that case, the black teenagers did not have power or prestige, and were asking a lot of their comrades and counterpoints. Gladwell is arguing that that kind of activism, the kind that truly challenges power, requires deep relationships. Notice how throughout the essay, he uses anecdote, the definition example pattern, and contrast in order to communicate his meaning. As you work on your own compositions, think about how you can use these techniques to further support your ideas.